Next, I'd like to kick us off by introducing Wes Haynes, an old friend of the Cultural Alliance and a partner in our own Fairfield County Preservation Network. As you see from his bio in your program, Wes has been rooted in working with historic preservation for many years and now has an exciting position as Director of Making Places, a new initiative of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. So please join me in welcoming Wes Haynes.
Well, good morning. I'm very honored to speak here today, but I am a poor substitute for my boss, Daniel McKay, who is at the National Trust Conference in Houston right now, and he was going to speak more about the work of preservation and the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. I may have erred on the side of creativity in coming up with a title for my talk. Old is the New Next. I gave a talk recently in New Canaan where I had the driest, most boring title possible about the legislative impact of historic preservation. And when I was being introduced, the people all ahead of me said, well, our speaker today is going to give a very dry talk. It sounds like a very heavy talk. So I wanted to keep this one a little bit lighter today. But I really believe, I've been in preservation for a long time, and I really love old buildings, and I love Connecticut. It's where I grew up, and the built environment here is really rich. We have some great stuff out there. And so I do think that old is really the new next. I like older buildings. Older buildings were all new at one point. But in terms of where we're going as a culture, as a society, I think that old buildings have a lot to give us, not just from the cultural angle. So we're going to start our story about Connecticut with the origin of historic preservation, which was really the first confluence of artists and the built environment that we know of, where the artists gathered together to save an important building. It was during the papal restoration of Rome. It was a large urban renewal project, and as the papacy was creating Rome as a major pilgrimage destination, they were basically mining all the existing buildings from the Roman Empire and reusing them in the new Vatican buildings. And the artist Raphael, who is pictured, his bust is up on the right, organized the Roman artists at the time to push back against the Vatican. And that was a pretty, he was speaking truth to power. It was a pretty gutsy thing to do. It did earn him being appointed to do as the first surveyor of historic monuments in Rome, which is the beginning of the preservation movement and the whole preservation methodology. We have no idea what he surveyed because there's nothing, he didn't leave a paper trail behind. But he did manage to save the Pantheon, which is one of the most remarkable buildings. Can everybody see the bottom of the slide from where you are with the table here? Oh, okay. And it's a really great example of what happens when you intervene positively. Next slide. And we're still today sort of in a kind of same mode that Raphael was in. This is a Greek open-air theater built in 1934 in Cowles Co. Does anybody here know this? Oh, okay. A few people do. It's on a private property in a very, very private residential area. And just like the Pope who wanted to take down the Pantheon, the new owner of the property wants to get rid of this incredible 300-seat open-air marble theater built of about 2,500 pieces of marble, individual marble. I'm here too to ask if anybody has any idea on what to do with this. The trust is involved with trying to get it off the site in the next 6 weeks. We have a couple of leads, but we need a new site for it. It's not a small object. It measures 100 feet by 100 feet. And it's about 9 feet high, and it has a pit that's about 3 feet deep. So it's not exactly something that'll fit in everybody's backyard. but it's a really terrific resource. So I just use this to point out, because it's a project that's in our office right now, that we're still doing the same kind of stuff that Raphael did, but we've moved beyond the cultural, just the exclusive cultural impact of preservation. We now see it as an economic, and it touches on all the themes of today's conference. Next slide, David. Which are creativity, sustainability, and affordability. And I think that in terms of old buildings are the new next in terms of all these three themes. Next slide. I heard Professor Max Page, he's a professor at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, speak a couple of weeks ago on why preservation matters at a conference in New Haven. And I've stolen some of Max's ideas for this topic. I sort of had a lot of reflection about, in light of the election results the other night, about how I would go about this. Max touched on many of the same themes that are present in the conference today. He also brought in the theme of social justice, which I think is a very important theme for preservation right now. My program is called Making Places, and it's all about places where things were made. These are creative places, they're industrial places, and it's all about placemaking, which is a concept in urban design right now about creating dynamic urban centers. So I firmly believe that Connecticut's great wealth of industrial places, we've inventoried 1,400 standing industrial properties that are historic in the state, and many different states of repair. Some have been rehabbed all the way down to abandoned and vacant and distressed. And there's all sorts of gradients in between of their condition. But they really are the future of Connecticut. If we can get these buildings back online, we can have some really exciting things happening in our communities. Next slide. So I'll start with the theme of sustainability. And I think when we think about sustainability, we're thinking in terms of alternate energy and energy conservation. Next slide. And our headquarters is in an old boarding house for the Eli Whitney Works in Hamden, up on the left. And we're about to make a bold leap for preservationists and put solar panels on the roof of this very old historic building. And the board of the trust right now and the staff are all on board that we have to demonstrate some leadership to demonstrate that historic buildings can be easily adapted in terms of the use characteristics of them, how they're used. But the really important argument about historic buildings is that they embody energy already. There was energy that was spent when they were built, and that has a certain value, and you can calculate that value. And next slide. And I was really kind of struck by a press release from U-Haul last week that they've just acquired a building in New Haven, an industrial building, and they're going to be converting it to a U-Haul facility, a storage facility. But their argument in doing such is as follows, and I'll quote at length. By repurposing the Cowles Company building at 83 Water Street, a U-Haul sustainability analysis determined that it is preventing 244 tons of metal manufacturing and transportation from being used, eliminating 12,150 tons of new concrete pours, keeping 12,463 tons of construction and demolition debris out of landfills, and stopping 5,892,837 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions from entering the atmosphere. This building is a piece of history, said a representative of U-Haul. I am excited to reuse this majestic structure while making sure less carbon emissions are being put into the air. Keeping New Haven's history alive is important to U-Haul. Well, I'm not sure if it's the driving business plan for U-Haul to keep New Haven's business, but I do appreciate that they did hire a good articulate marketing consultant to come up with an articulate statement about why these buildings are important. I mean, this is the value of them. That energy has already been expended, and construction and demolition debris just going into the landfill to create a new building makes no sense right now. We can't afford that as a planet. We can't. Whether you buy into climate change or not, which our politicians, some of them have a difficult time wrapping their heads around, but it's a really important objective that it doesn't make any sense. It's very wasteful. Next slide. So I think that that's the strongest sustainability argument for old buildings. Now, in terms of affordability, we're entering into a somewhat more complex terrain here. Next slide. There's a lot of industrial space in Connecticut that is, I would say, not fully improved. It sort of hasn't really been fixed up since our energy pretty much left the state in the 1970s. It's operating at a low boil. Down on the bottom here is a part of the Phillips plant in Glenbrook, a neighborhood in Stafford. And up in the left, it's now being populated for the first time by artists. And would there be any chance that Holly Danger is here today? Okay. She's opened up a new gallery here. This was pretty much machine shops. She's kind of a first pioneer going into this building here. She was displaced from the Yale and Town complex in the South End, which has now been converted to lofts and residential lofts. And then all over the state, though, you'll find these kind of little industrial parks. And I think that these are really the places that artists need to start looking, especially visual artists need to start looking for cheap space. Next slide. There's a nice development. It's not exactly close to Fairfield County, but it's up in South Willington, which is about the same distance we are today from New Haven. They're from closer to Worcester, Massachusetts than New Haven. But this is a labor of love by a second generation of a family that has been curating this building for a long time. And he's leasing it out to artists and creative uses. He has a performing arts space there. I mean, they're nowhere near a population center, but the rents run from about $8 a square foot to $22 a square foot, depending on the size of the space you get. And that includes garbage removal and heat and lighting, all utilities. So it's a pretty good deal. It's just not particularly close to Fairfield County. Next slide. And he is a really good example of an old strategy of taking over these buildings, sweat equity. Preservationists have been doing that for generations. Next slide. And it's probably best known on a small scale. After Katrina, a lot of the faith community and college communities found their way to New Orleans to help rebuild the lower Ninth Ward and other distressed parts of the city. This is a group of students from Marquette that were down there for 3 weeks and working on houses. And they were able to transform small-scale shotgun houses, very, very distressed, into wonderful places to live in much better condition than they were before Katrina. So sweat equity is, if you can't afford to buy the building outright or hire a contractor, you put a lot of volunteer time into it. And it's still a concept that's valid today. Next slide. And just to compare, on the left is one building that the celebrity Brad Pitt, the actor, built in the lower Ninth Ward. And for the investment that he put into building that one building, he could have done 3 shotguns. So he could have created 3 units of housing instead of 1. So there is an economic value with this sweat equity model that was going on in Katrina. The acquisition costs were very low. You could get a shotgun after Katrina for anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000, and with an investment of about $80,000 in terms of just materials and some of the trades that you had to have licenses for, you could get the building back online, which was really pretty incredible. Next slide. 5 minutes will give us Okay. Well, we can just take it here then. We can just wrap it up here. But
Well, there's 10 more minutes.
Oh, 10 more minutes. Okay, great. All right. Okay. Let's move on then. Now, what we have in Fairfield County is very unlike, it's not like the New Orleans market. We have, if you follow the three rules of real estate, which are location, 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 we're in one of the highest land value areas in the United States. And it's very difficult to do sweat equity projects because you can't buy a building for $30,000 in Fairfield County. Next slide. One of the strategies that's been developed with open space preservation to deal with land value and the land value of open space is called transfer of development rights, where you can develop the developmental value of space off of open agricultural lands, and this is going on in the eastern part of the state right now in a big way, and take those and kind of bank those in urban areas and build up the urban areas. So it's a way of creating more density in downtowns while you're preserving open space. It creates more of like a European landscape where you have cities that don't sprawl out into the countryside so much. It's been used in big major cities like Chicago and New York, where you transfer the unbuilt value of an urban parcel off of a landmark building and transfer it to another site. Next slide. And we're sort of exploring it right now with one of our trust projects in Stafford, where the Blickensderfer typewriter factory was scheduled for demolition. I don't know if you can really read this that well, but Blickensderfer is up, it's an L-shaped object up at the top that a developer had proposed a tower on top of. It's a great building. It'll convert to many, many uses, but it'll also convert nicely to residential lofts. And so we're in negotiation right now with the developer to relocate his tower off of our site and to give him some benefits to take the air rights from above that site and transfer it to another site. And it seems to be working at this point. I'll have you keep your eye on the Connecticut Trust newsletter to find out how it goes down at the end of the day. Next slide. Another urban strategy that hasn't really been tried in Connecticut since the 1980s is the community land trust idea, where an entity, a nonprofit entity usually, starts buying up large blocks or acquiring large blocks of urban areas. They separate the land from the buildings. They rehab the buildings. They use the land as leverage to go and acquire mortgages for owners that, or actually they're leaseholders in the houses. It's a great model for artists. It does require some foundation support as seed money to begin. So one of the best, you may be aware of this project in Houston. It's Project Row Houses. Again, we're back to shotguns. We're at smaller scale buildings than we have in Connecticut. But this was catalyzed by an artist who approached a foundation. He bought up 2 blocks of row houses. These were done with sweat equity from the artists, and they're occupied by artists. And they're live-work places for artists in shotguns. So it's basically the land trust, the community land trust model plus the sweat equity model together. Next slide. Incentives. Next slide. Because the Department of Economic and Community Development, our state community development organization, recognizes the vacating of industry from in the small scale industry. We still have the big industries in Connecticut, but the small scale industries that were in every community, that was a market failure that kind of took everybody by surprise. They've created a lot of state incentives, and there are also federal incentives in terms of financial incentives to attract people to redevelop these properties. The good news is that they really work well for adapting mill buildings to residential lofts. Everything is really weighted towards that type of redevelopment. What's not really weighted is to develop them towards artist studios or mixed-use mills, which we are calling MUMs these days, or schools, or even industrial reuse. So right now, the money is out there to use them for loft conversions, but not to convert industrial buildings to studio space. Next slide. So creativity, the third theme of the conference today. Next slide. There are things happening in mill buildings, and there is industry coming back in. This is American Woolen in Stafford Springs. They're producing really high-quality woolen mills with some of the state incentives from the Department of Economic and Community Development. And this was a woolen mill. The labor force was still in place. They had to retool the building entirely differently for the new production, but they are creating wool in this space now. Next slide. Okay. You may know Real Artways in Hartford. That's a studio conversion, but that was all done with private equity. Next slide. And I think someone may have referred to the Whiting Mills. It's a sock mill in Winstead that's also done with private equity. In fact, they funded this through a second mortgage on their own house to get this developed. There are no state incentives for this. They could have used the tax credit for historic rehabilitation that Todd will be talking about this afternoon, but they never had enough money to capitalize a major project. So shared space, very, very quickly. One of the best examples that I know of a really successful arts organization is in Brooklyn. It started out in a church, a landmark church. It was called Arts at St. Anne's. It's a presenting and performance organization. They left the church after 18 years there and moved into a warehouse in Dumbo and became St. Anne's Warehouse. And next slide. And recently, they've just taken over a ruinous building, next slide, and built within it a brand new state-of-the-art theater. So they started out as a shared space. They were sharing space with a religious organization, and over the course of 30 years, they now have a state-of-the-arts facility. So I just wanted to sort of suggest that there is light at the end of the tunnel if you're young and you have the long view in place. Thanks. Oh, there's a microphone. Yeah. So the question is, did St. Anne rent for the time that they were there? They did pay a fee to the church. It was a three-legged stool that created that. The church had been empty, so the diocese put a new congregation in the church, merged two parishes. The New York Landmarks Conservancy, where I was working at the time, took over the responsibility for restoring the building, and the arts was there and they paid a nominal rent, but they also were fundraising on their own as a separate entity. The problem was that sharing the sanctuary, they had to break down every Sunday for services. But it worked for a number of years, and they did mostly music presentations. When they moved into the Dumbo, into the warehouses, they were paying just market rent. David Willentis, who's a big developer in the Dumbo area, he bought up a lot of industrial property. He was giving the art community a break while he was waiting for the neighborhood to turn around. And then they kept getting displaced from one warehouse to the other until they found their own home.
Hi, my name is Janine Esposito. I wanted to ask about the economics of housing artists, because as an artist, one of the things I've seen happen over and over is that artists come in and people rent to artists, and they don't have to give that many services, yes, lights, heat, which you would expect. And then while the artists are living there, they start improving the property, and then all of a sudden, either the rents get too high for the artists or it becomes much more attractive for people to buy it. And I'm wondering, what do the economics have to be? What kind of mixed use do you need so that artists don't get tossed? Because, you know, for generations now, artists have been gentrifying areas and then getting displaced. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you summarized the process perfectly. And it's still going on in Brooklyn. I mean, a lot of Brooklyn people are getting priced out. They're starting to look in Connecticut. they'll gentrify our neighborhoods too at some point. But probably the best solution that we've come up with at the Trust, there are commercial condos, a structure, and if artists would sort of organize like commercial condos, they would have some security. They'd have to get in early to the building to get it. So, you wouldn't be looking necessarily in Bridgeport right now, but you would be looking out in the periphery. And there's an example of that in Cheshire. It's Ball and Socket Arts. They have acquired a highly polluted building. It's a real problem child. They are getting support for cleaning it up, but they're going to be operating that more like a condominium with artists rather than depending on an external landlord to pay for them. So they actually have control of the site. But it's just really expensive to acquire the buildings. As distressed as they are in Bridgeport, it's really hard to get into the market. So if you want to lease, you're at the whimsy of the developer until the market changes.